Hey everyone, Rizzo here. And before we get into the video proper, I'd like to issue a quick little disclaimer. In case you were unaware, I was invited out to Sledgehammer Games' studio to play the map early a couple weeks ago. Just figured I'd get that out of the way now, in case you believe that clouds my judgment or invalidates the review, or whatever the internet believes. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. Before we settle into the armrests of the Shadowed Throne, okay, that one was kind of a stretch. I'd like to, once more, go over the changes we've seen to the mode since the release of the last map, The Darkest Shore. And, again, if you'd just like to skip to my thoughts on the map itself, go to the on-screen timestamp. So, let's recap. Like last time, the game has changed significantly over the past few months. Sadly, we haven't seen any new mods or consumables, which is admittedly kind of disappointing, but regardless, let's focus on what we do have. We've seen numerous bug fixes and weapon rebalances, most notable being the buff of the Enfield No. 2's ammo count, and the fixing of gung-ho when combined with dual-wield weapons. Before patch, you would still have to play the sprint out animation before firing. Because of this, gung-ho saw very limited usage. At least by me. Fall damage has been completely removed from the game, so no more dying or losing Geistchild pieces just because you have the audacity to jump from something 3 feet off the ground. 7 new weapons have been added that can be used across all the maps. The MG81, M38, E-Traverse Assault Rifle, M2 Carbine, someone will correct me, Type 5, Sterling, and of course, the Type 38 Sniper Rifle. Still no new shotguns though. Kinda disappointing, but what can you do? What can you do? The supplies tab has been added to the Zombies main menu. From here you can pick up your mail, visit the quartermaster, see Rideau's dead horrifying eyes, and last but certainly not least, you can pick up your long-touted contracts and orders. We've been waiting for these for quite a few months, and I gotta say, they were well worth the wait. These add a ton of replayability to the game, and personally keep me coming back every day to see what's new. It also lets me build up armory credits and supply drops each day just by relaxing and killing the undead, instead of having to sweat my ass off in multiplayer. Why they weren't there earlier on, we can only speculate. Probably had something to do with really tight DLC schedules and a relatively small zombies team compared to the multiplayer and campaign guys, but like I said, they're here now, and like Frosted Flakes, they're great. So it's safe to say that the game is in an even better place than we left it a couple months ago. And just like last time, the voice of God himself has promised a bunch of cool new stuff coming soon. So it's probably just gonna keep getting better. And finally, with all the changes covered, it's time to get into the Shadowed Throne. As we always do, we'll start first with the positives and then move into the negatives later. The map design and flow. Like the other maps in World War II, the map's design and general flow is very solid. However, like the Darkest Shore, the map is very close quarters and doesn't offer a lot of kiting opportunities. I'm never gonna stop saying kiting. The only solid kiting area in the entire map is the Hidden Courtyard, which requires you to do most of the map's main quest to unlock. The map's special weapon variety. Let's list off what we got so far. There might even be more. The Wunderbuss, 6 new melee weapons I believe? No, 7, the blade. And even the previous map's wonder weapons like the Ripsaw and Tesla Gun returned through the Hangman Easter egg in the square. This really helps spice up the gameplay, especially when compared to the rather lacking weapon selection of the Darkest Shore. The melee weapons and their differing form of attack. Unlike Raven the Redwoods, the melee weapons are actually very different from one another, and each suits a different kind of playstyle. For example, the Trench Knife and the Dancer's Dagger are more suited to a defensive playstyle, whereas the Ice Pick and Nazi Axe are purely made for offense and actively encourage aggressive play. You can probably guess which one I gravitated towards. Sadly, I didn't find the Smuggler's Bat to be all that useful. It just seemed like it had no niche to fill compared to the rest of the weapons on offer. Kinda like the FG-42 that got nerfed 48 separate times. The style and consistency of the world. Like the Darkest Shore to the Final Reich, the Shadowed Throne immediately sets itself apart from the previous entry by changing up the map's style and tone, while at the same time, making sure it feels stylistically consistent with the rules of the previously established universe. This is something that World War II has received some flack for. Some people say that all the maps feel a bit too samey, so to speak, but I personally feel like this is one of the game's greatest strengths. The technology and style intentionally remains consistent across all maps, making every experience feel, to quote the man himself, like a different chapter in the same story. Compare this to Zelensky's Black Ops 2 universe. Nuketown, Transit, Die Rise, love 'em or hate 'em, felt like a consistent universe, and it made it a lot easier to get invested in the world they were setting up. And then, I think you know where I'm going with this, Buried comes in and completely ruins it. Aside from abandoning all interesting plot threads set up by the previous entries, it further estranges itself from the story by completely changing the style and tone set up in the previous maps. Those maps painted a picture of a desperate, destroyed world, where the few remaining survivors tore each other apart due to paranoia brought on by two ethereal puppet masters with incompatible demands. Barry dropped all of that in favor of an awkward, cartoonish western town with no references made to the previous lore, an 18 billion foot tall goofball, and ghosts for no reason. The point I'm trying to make here is that the importance of a consistent narrative and universe cannot be overstated. It's how you hook an audience and get them invested. And as we saw with Buried, Shadows of Evil, and kind of the Origin Saga in general, when you deviate too far from what you set up, the response can be lukewarm, to put it lightly. The sound design. One thing I've constantly praised World War II for has been its sound design. Everything from the subtle environmental noises to the primitive animalistic screech of the Moishla, the sound design is an aspect that this game has consistently nailed, and the Shadow Throne is no different. Being a war-torn city, there's constant screaming, gunfire, and explosions going on all around you, which, like WWII, really helps sell the environment. But the best bit of sound design is the wail of the new zombie type, the Gekko. Let's talk about this guy real quick. My first encounter with him was the only time I was scared during this map. Primarily being, you don't expect that high-pitched wail and insane movement speed. I expected your standard whistling-esque roar, where it's low and grumbly and weird, and a slightly faster movement speed, but nope, that fucker books it. I also really like him from a gameplay stance. Being a player that's constantly on the move, I appreciate that there's a zombie type that keeps me on my toes. It's like the Varrock sprinters, but even more horrifying, the vocal performances. Like I predicted in my initial coverage of the game, the actors have largely begun settling into their roles and embodying their characters a bit better, especially Catherine Winnick. In the final right, quite a few of her and Ving's lines were hampered by awkward deliveries.
That sounds like flies buzzing. But it's too cold for flies.
Which is to be expected at first, I guess. The Ultimates crew went through it back in Shino Numa. Malcolm McDonald's had a couple clunkers in WWII before improving in Revelations.
What to do?
I didn't say he was perfect, okay? And while I hate their characters in air quotes, God, I just did air quotes in real life with my fingers. What an asshole. The Infinite Warfare Zombies cast admittedly got much better as the season went on. While we're on the topic of dialogue, you might be asking, well, Rizzo, you go on about the dialogue, but you almost always play as special characters. Why not play as the main four? Well, this is why.
Those oversized lawn darts are our best chance to pop this balloon. Oversized lawn darts are our best chance to pop this darts are our best chance. Those oversized lawn darts are our best chance to pop this balloon.
Every single round, the characters just won't shut up. Yeah, I get it, Drostin. We need to take down the Led Zeppelin, but maybe I don't want to do that this game. Maybe I just want to relax for an hour or so and kill some zombies.
Those oversized lawn darts are our best chance to pop this balloon.
The map's story. While I don't find it as enthralling as the lore of the Moishlas and Nerthus from the Darkest Shore, the Shadow Throne continues the logical and grounded event progression established in the previous two maps. Straub's Reich was created to assist the Nazis toward the end of the war, so it's only logical that at some point we'd see it used on the front line. It's also logical that everything that could go wrong would go wrong for every side. The Russians were forced to retreat, the citizens of Berlin were to be slaughtered in their homes by Straub to help cleanse the fatherland. And of course, since we killed Straub, his army would get out of control and everything would be kinda screwed. Speaking of which, Straub dies. Holy shit, I did not see this coming so early in the season. Sure, I figured he would go down eventually, but we're only halfway through the season and the main villain is super dead. This was a really pleasant surprise after 3 relatively predictable zombie seasons. Maybe it was 4. Yes, I know, the final maps in each of these games were unexpected, but the journey there was pretty point A to point B. Still can't believe they drug Extinction out of mothballs. Now that we're through the big things, it's time once again to get into the little things that help round out the experience. The radio frequency puzzle. I love this puzzle, primarily because you can actually figure this one out without video help. When I incorrectly entered the frequency, I noticed after a while that there were some numbers on top of it. So I went back to the chart in the church and tried aligning the numbers I saw on top to those of the chart, and voila, it worked. It was a nice little eureka moment. Speaking of the radio, the new unlockable in-map camo. All you have to do is just set your frequency to 3535, I believe, and you get a new camo. You can actually see Russian soldiers fighting zombies on occasion. It's a nice touch that helps sell the world just a wee bit more. And if you're feeling particularly mischievous, you can execute them if you're quick enough. Kinda completely changes the tone of the story to have one of our characters brutally execute a Russian ally. The classic PPSH is back, the Hangman Easter egg, and the goodies it can give you. There's 3 new special characters that aren't reskins. You can easily identify the type of weapon you need to give the smuggler. You can also save him from dying via whistling if you give him an upgraded version of said weapon. Saving him has no real effect on gameplay, story, or the quest itself, but it's just a nice little Easter egg. Okay, turns out I was wrong and saving the smuggler is actually canonical. Not only that, but he was so thankful for us helping him that he actually joins the Bureau of Archaic Technologies and becomes a necromantic special character. I've said it countless times, but it really is the little things, you know? So where does this map leave us story-wise? Well, we have all the pieces to Barbarossa's sword, Straub is dead, his army is unleashed upon Berlin, and our cast of canonical allies could potentially expand, what with Radog's... Oh, fuck off. Again? And our cast of canonical allies could potentially expand, what with Radog recruiting specialists after the events of the Darkest Shore. Yes, I know that last part technically wasn't mentioned in-game, and was just something Cameron said on Twitter, but shh. It's all canon to me. Speaking of which, Cameron said on Zombros that this will be the last map where Straub's Reich will be confined to the shadows, and that things are going to get much bigger going forward. And to be honest, this has me very worried, primarily because of how this jump in storytelling went last time. Let's flash back to Exo Zombies. DLC 2 was the map where the zombie outbreak went public and, in the words of Oz,
blazed like a firestorm across the Western Hemisphere, consuming everyone and everything in its path.
But it's also where the story became a hackneyed mess of underdeveloped, unfocused ideas. It couldn't decide if it wanted to focus on the 5 characters or be this big, epic zombies adventure. And because of that, it completely fell apart and destroyed any goodwill that they had built up with the previous maps. I know it's not fair to judge this game based on the mistakes of a previous one, but like I said, I can't help but be a bit worried about the future. And with that, I feel that it's time to get into the part of the video that I always edit first because it's admittedly much easier to get in depth about the things you don't like. That's right, it's time for the bad. As with any map, yes, even Mob of the Dead, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There's always something to take issue with, and the Shadow Throne is no exception. Starting off with the lack of scare factor. The Final Reich and the Darkest Shore both had some brilliantly crafted scares, but aside from the previously mentioned Whale of the Gekok, I'm just gonna call him the Sizzler, I can't pronounce this right, but aside from the previously mentioned Whale of the Sizzler, I was never really scared in any of my playthroughs, which was a bit of a disappointment as I really dug the full-on horror take of the Final Reich and the Darkest Shore. It was fun to be scared of zombies again, especially since the last time I felt that was Verrückt back in 2009. Personally, I'd really like to see the future maps return to a spookier atmosphere and not fall into the trapping of, if it's bigger, it's better. Moving on. For as well as the map flows, I'd be remiss in mentioning the few issues I have with it. Primary being that certain lanes in the map are far too narrow. Mainly I'm talking about the drop pod doors. They're only large enough for a single player's hitbox to easily get through at once. So if a zombie, or worse yet, a whistling, just so happens to be coming through on a higher round where killing them quickly is not a possibility, then it can result in one of those dreaded, what the hell was I supposed to even do? Moments that, funny enough, the other besieged World War II Zombies map had, but for entirely different and more annoyingly frequent reasons. The Pack-a-Punch method restricts use of throwing knives or bouncing betties in solo. Since you need explosives to open the wall panels, you have to pack some form of throwable grenade in your loadout. The only ways to circumvent this in solo are to acquire the Fliegerfaust by pure chance, or have the Mark II mod, Free Fire, and an M1911. Personally, I find this decision quite baffling. Speaking of baffling, it's time for the big one, the main quest. I know that it was a conscious decision to make the game harder for solo players, but oh man, do I have some problems with this. Many steps are not solo friendly. The safe, for instance. If you're not using camouflage or shell shock, well, tough shit for you. But Rizzo, couldn't you just wait until the round is transitioning and then open it? Well, that's a good idea. In theory. But in practice, by the time you're just about to line up that final number, the round transition graphic is going to pop up right in front of the dial, and you won't be able to properly line it up. Did I mention that the safe is super sensitive to how you line things up, the Morse code, and statue steps? I think I said this during my review of The Beast from Beyond, but I'll say it here again. Any step where I have to look up an external source or write things down on a notepad immediately makes me hate it. Previous examples of this include the gas valves in Gorod Krovi, where you had to go to Milo's website, the alchemy in Attack of the Radioactive Tragedy, where you had to look at this giant Google Docs document that is no longer available, and Neil's floppy disks in The Beast from the East. However, there is a slight positive to the Morse code. See, there's only a certain amount of possible Morse code audio files that can play, so you can just write down every example you've ever seen, put them in a little notepad document, and just put them in until you unlock the cabinet by sheer chance. I've done this like 6 times. The boss fight. The boss itself, I'm not gonna lie, his design is super cool, but he just doesn't stand out or have much of a presence during the actual fight, especially when compared to previous bosses. The best examples of bosses that make an impact and stand out during the fights are the Keeper, the Dragon and Manticore Mech, Silent Bob, Mephistopheles, the Panzer Mortar, and the Meistermoschles. All of these bosses, occasionally questionable game design aside, stand out and have a genuine presence in-game, whereas the Stadjäger just kinda blends into the crowd of 40 Wusslings. It's really hard to feel threatened by a boss when half the time I'm asking, okay, is that the main boss or is it just another Wussling? That crowd of Wusslings actually leads me into my next point, the special enemy spawn points and spawn rates. The spawn rates feel a bit too high for how close quarters and cramped the map is. I feel the previous 2 maps achieved a near perfect balance in this category, but in the Shadowed Throne, it feels like the Wusslings and Bombers pile up way too quickly in the higher rounds. And lastly, Ryan Gosling's The Notebook still isn't back. I know, it'll probably never return and was likely just a tool to familiarize new players with the mode, but its absence still fills my heart with sadness. And now that we've covered the main things I took issue with, let's take a minute or 3 to go over the more nitpicky stuff. During the intro, Jefferson appears to have a cut line, but they left in the animation data for said line, so it just looks like he's flapping his gums for no reason. There's no animation or effects for when the boards collapse under you in the square. They just disappear. The Ripsaw is missing all sounds associated with a heavy attack. The Wonderbus's battery model disappears when you get more than a couple feet away from it, and since the accompanying effects aren't all that pronounced, you might miss it if you're just glancing around the area. In the square, Wusslings can clip directly through the bus next to the cabaret, so you'll just be minding your own business when suddenly a Wusling charges right through a solid object. At least they don't get stuck there forever like gargoyles. Next to the bar wallby, there's a zombie spawn that isn't particularly well placed, so you can just see zombies pop in from another dimension. Kinda takes you out of the immersion when zombies just up here, you know? The Nailbat's world model isn't properly aligned with the dead soldier's hand, so it just kinda floats there. Where are the bat variants? When Straub dies, he has no face posing. That immediately took me out of the moment on my first viewing. Instead of feeling shocked that, holy shit, the main antagonistic force is dead already, I was too busy thinking, I wonder why they didn't give his death animation the appropriate face posing. I mean, the model still has the bones in-game and everything. On the topic of face posing, the Russian soldiers lack face posing as well, which makes executing them all the more awkward. They just blankly stare at you while you jam a knife into their eye.
Oh, fuck. I can't believe you've done this.
Seriously, there's still no new bats. When Rideau arrives in the outro, there's no sound effect present for him hitting the zombie behind the Meistermoschel. I feel like I'm missing something. Can't quite remember. Oh right, the launch! Why would this be a bad thing? It was like a 30-minute diversion that gave me a bit of a giggle. At least it wasn't like Outbreak where the download was bugged for season pass holders for 13 hours. Oh yeah, did I mention that happened a second time with Infection? So, in conclusion, I feel that the Shadowed Throne is a sizable improvement over the Darkest Shore that addresses many of the common complaints of said map. Its weapon variety is fantastic, the traps are effective again, and there's just much more meat on the bone this time around. However, like I said, it does fumble in some other areas. Primary being that the special enemy spawn rate feels a bit excessive for the map's layout, and the map's tone veers a bit too far into action territory for my liking. I get that the latter is more personal preference than anything, but I figured I'd mention it regardless. If these two issues weren't there, this would easily be my favorite map of the game, but as it stands, I think I like the Final Reich a wee bit more, which is no small feat, mind you. The Final Reich is one of my favorite Zombies maps to date, so of course topping it is gonna be hard in my eyes. But the fact that they even got close is a damn good sign. Regardless, I really enjoyed this map, and I'll likely be playing it far into the future, whereas I kinda tuned out of the Dark Ashore a couple weeks after I posted my review. Well, that's all for today. If you enjoyed, there's a playlist down in the description that contains all the other long-winded reviews I've made in the past. Some of them aren't as good as the newer ones, I'll admit, but it's interesting to see where you've come from, you know? Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a great day.